Today on Moment of Zen, we're airing a conversation I had with Samo Burja a few months ago about how Mexican cartels operate within the country's political system, fueling both the fentanyl crisis and illegal immigration. This is essential context for understanding the Mexico tariff debates playing out in the media and online. Okay, so you wrote this brief on Mexican cartels. What inspired you to write the brief? What's going on? Let's get into it.
I think people have been commenting that Mexico might be a failed state for over a decade now. It's obviously important in the U.S. discourse related to border control, but it's also been a kind of talking point in the war on drugs. Mexico is also this interesting case where people considered that perhaps modern states are withering away and are going to be replaced by non-state actors. There is some truth to that, right? Around the world, drug revenues are one of the few kinds of revenue that can support and sustain an insurgency against the modern government. The Taliban, as well as other groups, were partially funded by drug money. The same was true of Chechen rebels in Russia, who basically would handle all the logistics of drug transportation. And then the revenue, which was, it was not revenue that was available to the state, could be used to fund basically a military action or even terrorist operations. There's also, of course, been other examples in Latin America, right? Places like Colombia. And of course, during the Cold War, there were several Marxist insurgencies that were funded by drug money. Finally, intelligence agencies around the world, because of their need to move money between countries, are sometimes involved in these illegal operations. If you have a plane or even a custom-built submarine, like say Pablo Escobar had at one point, that can cross a border undetected, transporting lots and lots of drugs, you can definitely also transport weapons. In fact, you need to transport weapons and people. So essentially, it is the same infrastructure that is used to evade, anti-drug policing that can be used to evade national security. And, today in the United States, there was this viral clip of, I think, a Turkish gentleman who's an undocumented migrant who just sort of crossed the border, recounted how he paid $10,000, to the Mexican cartels to cross the U.S. border, and then said, "Oh, this is kind of crazy. I just walked over the border. There's no, I'm a good person, but maybe there'd be bad people crossing the border." And that was like a very funny clip. It went viral on X.com. Did you see it?
Yeah, it's very funny.
Yeah. So there's this core function of the state, right, which is to maintain physical control of a territory, to have the monopoly on violence. And then there is this kind of like adversarial game, which is, shipping things across borders, shipping things obscurely, having things not be as they appear. That's then common with, basically drug import and export operations, terrorist organizations, insurgencies, and intelligence agencies. And because of all of those reasons, it seemed a good idea to do a detailed case study into the operation of Mexican cartels. It is probably not a huge part. It is not a huge part of Mexico's economy, but it is a huge part of Mexico's political economy. It is the most liquid industry, right? It is probably in total revenue smaller or comparable to Mexico's oil industry. So in an absolute sense, it's not a huge part of the economy, but precisely because it's an undocumented part of the economy, because it's an untaxed part of the economy, it becomes very powerful. To my surprise, the cartels are not actually insurgencies against the Mexican government. It makes sense if you think about it. Any for-profit operation at the end of the day doesn't want war. That's bad for business. they basically want an accommodation with the government, not to replace the functions of government. This is what's different about the cartels in Mexico, the drug cartels in Mexico, compared to, say, I don't know, like a drug smuggling operation in Chechnya or Afghanistan or Colombia. There you have an ideological motivation to overthrow the government, and you pair your ends with appropriate means. There are only a few ways you can fund an operation from territory that's still controlled by a government you're trying to overthrow. All of them are illegal. The drug trade probably has the best margins, right? Even if you do something like human trafficking, be it for prostitution or shipping people over a border, you have the logistical challenge of bringing human beings over in great numbers, rather than the much simpler challenge of bringing a powder or packaged plants over a border. So having said all of this, the liquidity, however, and it being untaxed, undocumented, this kind of revenue, right? That does have an impact on Mexico, but it amounts to something that seems a partnership between low-level and mid-level and even high-level officials in the Mexican state, where maybe your exit package isn't an advisory position with Raytheon or Boeing, but when you leave government, when you cease public service, maybe there is a bribe that you receive from the drug cartels. Now, the tricky part here is figuring out who's more powerful. Is it the government or is it the cartels? And I think in a way, there's a false dichotomy there, because the heads of the cartel seem to be killed and replaced fairly often, and the officials accepting the bribes mostly seem to get a slap on the wrist. So my thesis would be that the officials are actually pretty physically safe, and while they occasionally have internal fights between Mexico's elite, people are only, they only allow the cartels to kill people if they have a backing of at least a faction of Mexico's elite. So I think that Mexico's elites will sometimes play dirty, and the cartels will basically be their henchmen or, their patsies in a way. Because the heads of the cartel are killed so often, and sometimes even by government forces, I think they are ultimately in the subservient position. Now, this could change in the future. If there was a radical separatist ideology that became prominent in one of these cartels, they probably could represent a serious threat to the Mexican state. But the profit motive in itself has not yet been that catalyst. There's been no real separatist movements. There's no real desire to take on the functions of the state. The most the cartels do is this very classic mafia-style operation, which can be compared to how 1930s or 70s Sicily operated, where they give to charity and they give to local social causes, local religious institutions, almost as a way to launder their reputation and keep good PR.
And so is what's happened in Colombia with the FARC at one point, and the control that they had, they seem to have an ideology. Is that an example of sort of a cartel that rivaled the state, or what's a good example of sort of where a paramilitary group, really challenged the state in some way?
I mean, the FARC is a great example, right? Because it was, we should remember, a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group. I think the right metaphor here would be, while Stalin was a bank robber to fund the revolution, not every bank robber is a Stalin, right? It is necessary, if you are motivated to pursue and are organized to pursue a revolution, to find some source of funding. That source of funding might be, in the case of Lenin, historically it was the Germans, right? The Germans funded during World War I Lenin's operation in St. Petersburg. Or it might be, like in the case of Stalin, basically you start running organized crime, you do bank robberies. Or in the case of the Chechens, who were Islamist, nationalist separatists who wanted an independent Chechen republic when free of the Russian Federation, in that case, it might be the drug trade or the arms trade. Because, to have a rebellion, you kind of have to ship arms illegally against the wishes of the state anyway. So you have this infrastructure, these smuggler lines, and, the profit margins are just better on heroin than they are on explosives for most cases. And the demand is very high in a place like Moscow, or again, the United States is one of the largest drug markets in the world. Consumption is very high in, major cities. And I think this is partially also related to the explosion of the use of, basically legal drugs, right? The opioid crisis on a biological level, our bodies don't care if something's prescribed by the doctor or delivered by a local dealer. It's the same thing, right? So I think the U.S. medical system partially has, through its policies of giving people lots of painkillers, produced or augmented an illegal market as well, right? And that funding ultimately does go all the way back to the poppy growers in Afghanistan.
And so what should be done about that, or what could be done about that? Or is that just like kind of a indefinite, ongoing
Mhm.
thing that won't be addressed?
I think that with regard to the porousness of the U.S. border, this is not currently a critical national security interest. Like I know it's a common talking point. There is a social, economic, and cultural reason perhaps to limit illegal immigration. But for now, there's been no real, pervasive, huge terrorist threat. There is a reality of crime spilling over the border, but U.S. crime is not, U.S. disorganized crime is not under control in U.S. cities either, right? Store break-ins and, robberies and murders, that's all increased massively over the last few years in major American cities. So it's a policing issue. It's something that you do throughout a territory, which you do in a city rather than do at the border. Now, however, in the context of a ever-increasing competitive dynamic, like an ever-escalating competitive dynamic with China and Russia, the porous border becomes a liability, right? So essentially, the drug cartel lines that are open could be used by a foreign adversary to smuggle things into the country in an organized way. I made explicitly this sort of mental model that, if you're trying to, smuggle weapons to start a rebellion, you can also smuggle drugs, and you can sell the drugs, and then you can buy more weapons and pay your insurgents and have an organized army the way FARC does in Colombia, right? Like have paid full-time soldiers because you have a source of revenue. But it goes the other way. Even if this is just illegal shipping of drugs and currently has no national security problem, if paid, some of these cartels probably would smuggle anything over the border, right? And, the case is, it's currently not the case that Russia is, say, funding an insurgency in the American Southwest. But would the world need to be that different for that to be the case? Could not, Russia at some point in the next 10 or 20 years, or China, choose to do something very similar to what the U.S. did in Afghanistan in the 1980s? Of course, this is mostly international, but there's nothing sacrosanct about American soil, right? We saw that in the early 2000s with, 9/11. I don't think there's an imminent threat of sort of organized Islamic terrorism. I don't think that has much to do with the border. However, the infrastructure is there. And at that point, I think U.S. elites have sort of tolerated Mexican cartels because they understand, for two reasons. First off, I think when you go in the U.S. towards a more educated or privileged direction, people tend to have more libertarian views, let's say, or at least like libertine views about drugs. They tend to not think most drugs are bad. They tend to think that, it's basically an issue of bodily autonomy. They think that drugs should be legalized, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no elite level moral imperative to shut down the drug trade. no matter what is said during election season and no matter what, say, the majority of the US population might think. So that's point number one. But point number two is the US understands that currently the cartels strengthen the political parties in control of Mexico because it provides the various cartels that, divide Mexico's territory. They provide a source of revenue that can be used by Mexican politicians as a source of patronage to strengthen their political position. And because they desire some sort of good relations with the Mexican government and they don't want it to be a source of problem or trouble, they kind of allow these operations to carry on because there is no immediate pressing national security issue there. However, let's imagine that the US does find itself, and that's, like I said, quite plausible, in a situation where it has to shut down the cartels. I think that would result in an immediate political crisis in Mexico. Why? Because the Mexican state and the drug cartels have co-evolved over a very long time period. It's like this big part of Mexico's political economy. It basically has been, it has been something that has been part of its history for a very long time because it has been one of the exports that have not been controlled for a very long time, right? There were no, if it's already illegal and there's no control or there's very little control and the little control that exists can be bribed, well, then your tariffs are basically zero, right? The US government estimates from the last 15 years have settled on figures ranging from 6 to 29 billion annually for the amount of money going from the US to Mexico for illegal drugs. So we can kind of use that admittedly wide range as a sort of as a sort of Fermi estimate of the size of this economic activity. In 2023, there was a statistical estimate that the number of Mexicans working in the entire drug industry reaches a figure of about 175,000 people. That would be just 0.3 of Mexico's labor force. So, there is a very small minority working in this industry. They have high profit margins. It is a physically dangerous industry to be in, and it is the main source of corrupt revenues of key Mexican elites. If you shut that down, there's no mass unemployment, there's no economic shock. However, there's instantly a political crisis where a number of political parties and individuals who used to be powerful stop being powerful. And the question is, what's the alternative, right? Would these Mexican elites perhaps seek Chinese backing? Would there have to be US backing or US political support? It's not clear that perhaps shutting down the cartels won't destabilize a weak and dysfunctional Mexican state rather than sort of strengthen it.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with Netsuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/zen. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/zen. netsuite.com/zen. Let's talk about scaling digital commerce for a moment. When Mr. Beast launched Feastables, he faced a challenge of scale. How do you build an e-commerce infrastructure that can handle millions of concurrent shoppers, process transactions instantly, and maintain stability during massive traffic spikes? The answer turned out to be deceptively simple: Shopify. here's what's particularly interesting from a technical perspective. Shopify has built what's become the #1 checkout platform on the planet. They've created a system called Shop Pay that's solving one of e-commerce's biggest challenges, cart abandonment. The data shows it's boosting conversions by up to 50%. If you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. On the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between, everything's unified in one robust platform. It's a perfect example of how infrastructure, when done right, becomes a competitive advantage. Upgrade your business and get access to the same checkout system that powers Feastables. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/acognitive, all lowercase. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. So visit shopify.com/cognitive today. Shopify.com/cognitive.
So, given all this, if you were running the country or advising the country, what would you what should be done about this?
I do think that it's actually a very bad equilibrium for Mexico and Mexico's development. And the reason is because it is the same in kind as the sort of corrupt state-owned companies that are, basically, positions and profits from them are sort of distributed on the basis of political favoritism. Mexico's elites are extractive rather than productive. The best way to become more powerful and wealthier is to basically join or try to build your own clique, like join existing cliques or build your own clique. It is a difficult environment in which to do entrepreneurship. It's a difficult environment in which to organize production. And I think this truly has been holding Mexico back. It's good to remember that despite the massive advantage of having the United States right next door and the United States offshoring like crazy its industries in the last few decades, Mexico is not even the wealthiest Latin American country, right? That would be Chile, I believe, is highest GDP per capita. And, while Mexico has some industry and there have been attempts to expand it further, I just think the environment has to be one where extractive elites are thoroughly defeated. And once extractive elites are thoroughly defeated, all of these cultivated sources of corruption through the state companies and through the cartels and all these other sources of revenue that you can use in a patronage pyramid, if these are tamped down, if these are eliminated, this leaves space for the very small positive sum industry, the very small positive sum political economy, where the share of current and future investment, production, and growth beats out redistributing the current pie. So in other words, I do think you have to fight the cartels to industrialize Mexico. And that's a very unhappy prospect because you'll be constantly making enemies, not of like these random peasant crime bosses. Like if you look at the biographies of some of these guys, like, they're basically farmers. You look at someone like, it's sort of like El Chapo or someone like that, right? And these are people from basically a very rural background, a very impoverished background. So you're not fighting those guys. You're kind of fighting Mexico's wealthiest who have received bribes from guys like El Chapo and guys, that say are active in the Sinaloa cartel and so on. So that is kind of, there's a big problem. I think it's telling that the one part of Mexico that sort of has no trouble developing and becoming wealthier, Mexico City, is also where so many of Mexico's elites live. So they have sort of a vested interest to let that city develop, and they don't necessarily have a very strong interest in developing other parts of the country. Now, how could you approach this? I think you would ask for U.S. help. And if the U.S. was not willing to do more than a token effort, it would not be a bad idea for Mexico to turn to China and ask China for investment in Mexico as a sort of Belt and Road type thing. That is risky, but that would bring in heavy investment. And perhaps that would motivate the United States to consider that it perhaps has no choice but to try to develop Mexico further, or Mexico might become more China aligned. So no matter what you do as sort of the president of the country, you are dominated and downstream geopolitically of the United States. And the United States will ultimately not let you be disaligned, right? And the only question is like, can you extract from the possibility that you might align with China? Can you extract from that possibility economic concessions and security concessions that let you beat your own internal elites?
And if you're Trump, you going into looking at the next few years, what do you think our plan regarding Mexico should be? And one thing, a separate point but related, you write is that in your brief that the continued legalization of drugs might mean sort of less of a monopoly on the cartel, or it might hurt the cartel, pretty significantly. Say more about how that could play out, and what should U.S. policy towards Mexico be, or particularly on this issue?
I mean, the interesting thing is that when it comes to the cartels, before 2010, the cartels primarily grew marijuana and heroin for export to the United States. They also trafficked cocaine from Colombia. The legalization of marijuana in the U.S. since 2012, as well as the emergence of synthetic opioids like fentanyl, have caused the cartels to shift from farming to chemistry. So one could joke that sort of the Mexican cartels have undergone an industrial revolution, and they went away from being an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, right? With basically labs, cooking meth and other drugs. I think the legalization of any given drug would mean that they would shift to whatever remaining illegal drug there is. And while I think the US will continue to legalize drugs because of the ideological tendency I described and because of the general sentiment towards these social problems, I think fentanyl is like a great example of a drug that I don't expect will be legalized anytime soon. So legalization reduces their revenue. However, it also causes them to shift to whatever the most harmful yet popular drug is still banned, right? And I don't think we'll actually reach the point where all the drugs are ever legalized, especially since some of them truly are social blights. The key point being, with regard to the history of the Mexican government and the Mexican state, is that their involvement with the drug trade extends as far back as the 1940s, when the trade brought in substantial foreign currency and provided rural employment through basically growing marijuana and opium poppy cultivation. Prior to the 1960s, the drug trade was institutionalized, at a state level by governors like Sinola Leopold and so on, who served from 1963 to 1968. And other governors basically were complicit in it. State governors basically supervised the trafficking in their areas through the protection rackets that they ran. And it was only, in 1969 that the U.S. and Mexico signed an Operation Cooperation Agreement that was a framework for drug eradication. And that's the point where federal institutions started to be developed in Mexico to clamp down on the drug trade. The kind of balance of power between the regional governments and the central government has been this perpetual, between the regional governments and the federal government of Mexico, that's sort of been a perpetual political engine that has not really resolved. This tension has not been resolved one way or the other. It's not really that functional a federal system, and it's not really that functional a unitary system. The country is just kind of stuck, and whatever effects, whatever changes there are to the U.S. drug market, the consequences will play out fundamentally in this like regional versus central government struggle.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. In an age of AI and big data, your personal information has become one of the most valuable commodities. Data brokers are the silent players in this new economy, building detailed profiles of your digital life and selling them to the highest bidder. With data breaches happening frequently, these profiles aren't just fueling spam. They're enabling identity theft and putting your financial security at risk. But what if there's a way you could opt out of that system entirely? Incogni is a service that ensures your personal data remains private and secure. They handle everything from sending removal requests to managing any pushback from data brokers. What I trust most about Incogni is how it provides ongoing protection. Once you're set up, it continuously monitors and ensures your information stays off the market. Want to extend that peace of mind to your loved ones? Incogni's Family and Friends plan lets you protect up to 4 additional people under one subscription. Take control of your digital privacy today. Visit incogni.com/moment and try it risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code MOMENT at the link below and get 60% off your annual plan. Again, that's incogni.com/moment. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lanahan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork, billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
Are there examples of countries that have been racketed with the type of problems that Mexico has, but have been able to radically transform them and emerge from it much stronger and in a different, much less corrupt situation? Or what's sort of the shining example that Mexico should strive towards here?
I mean, the interesting thing is I don't really think that there were that many countries that have successfully gone through that transformation, because so few countries have really transitioned successfully in the modern era from like an agricultural situation to an industrial situation. The only big picture historical answer might actually be China, where the opium wars were, the British Empire sort of fighting for free trade, where of course free trade just meant delivering opium to many, many addicts in China. And that's considered sort of a very dark period of Chinese history. China had to go through a massive civil war. And after a massive civil war, there was this long period of totalitarianism, Mao's China, essentially. And they were just very, very lucky to, at the end of this sort of political bloodbath on several levels, right? First, there's a civil war, very damaging. Then there is, the warlord period, civil war. Then there are these like massive Great Leap related fatalities, these massive political purges, including the Cultural Revolution. There's almost no one left standing politically. And Deng sort of brings the country towards reform. And it's not even directly tied to this eradication of the opium trade, right? The opium trade is almost like, it becomes less and less important. It became much less important in the 20th century to Britain. And Britain was not interested in pursuing it or backing it for its economic and foreign policy goals. And the whole country sort of went through such a fundamental transformation and then industrialization that, this kind of smuggling wasn't important. But the key distinction here, where the analogy sort of breaks down, is that China wasn't producing the opium. China was just importing it, right? So I think that in principle, like I said, this is not a large part of Mexico's economy. This is not that big a business in terms of GDP. It's a big business in terms of elite elite incomes and elite compensation and the political economy of the country. I think that a successful industrialization just makes agriculture less profitable unless it's subsidized. And whatever country is in play can simply not subsidize the drug trade, can simply effectively police production of drugs that are actually harmful. Because there's at the end of the day, there's no such thing as only exporting something that's harmful. Unsurprisingly, in Afghanistan, especially in Kabul, heroin addiction is a huge problem because heroin is cheap and life kind of sucks. People are relatively poor. There are few other options for what to do with your life, what kind of entertainment to seek. Part of it is sort of the Taliban ban on music and alcohol, etc. But the bulk of it is just poverty. So successful industrialization will almost by definition make drug production much less important. Lucrative, perhaps, but less economically important. And it's not going to be the only means of making money anymore. So in other words, you sort of want to diversify your economy away from an agricultural economy. I think there's almost no way at all to transform businesses that are poppy growing businesses into something like cotton growing businesses. I think that was always sort of a pipe dream. It was one of the goals of the U.S. in its nation building effort in Afghanistan from 2001 to the early 2020s. But these sorts of programs almost never worked. The only solution is to basically have the country no longer be an agricultural country, but turn it into an industrial power, because the profit margins are just always better on export of, the sort of illegal drugs compared to, say, I don't know, exporting soy or corn or something like that. Partially because the developed world in its industrial agriculture just kind of dominates production. Like, this is something people perhaps do not appreciate properly, is that it's sort of the United States and to a lesser extent Europe and to a lesser extent Russia, Ukraine, and China that are feeding the third world rather than the other way around. Industrial agriculture just produces food at such cheap prices that farming in the third world struggles to compete. And they can only compete on stuff that Western agriculture doesn't want to compete on. That's why the marijuana legalization pushed the cartels to change their business model so fundamentally.
In closing, why don't you present kind of the bull case and the bear case for Mexico as it relates to these topics when we look at the kind of in summary, when we look at the years to come?
Okay, the bull and bear case. The bull case for Mexico specifically is that the United States is pursuing an aggressive policy of reshoring and friendshoring. There is a hope that the diversification away from China will massively assist Mexico's industrialization. The bear case is that if economic integration with Mexico and the industrialization of Mexico made sense, the 1990s efforts to produce things like NAFTA, that was kind of a precursor for a sort of North American Union analogous to the European Union, that would have already happened. There would have already been legal free movement of goods and services across the border. There would have already been heavy investment into Mexico's economy. With regard to the global drug trade, I think that I am pessimistic, right? While I'm not in favor of excessive invasion of privacy or excessive state control of the flow of things like money or the flow of goods over borders. So I'm not necessarily super interested in pursuing an intensified war on drugs. However, I do think a society that consumes a lot of drugs, whether they're legal or not, whether they're medicalized or not, is a society that is fleeing its problems. It's not actually just harmless fun when it's done to excess. It is a form of escapism, right? It's a form of retreat from the activities of production, from the activities of learning, from having children, from living life well, from like hanging out with your friends, etc. And I am pessimistic about the Western world, and also the East Asian world, right? I'm also as pessimistic about China. I think we've structurally made it so that there are many, many people who feel an acute spiritual and mental health crisis that will cause them to turn towards drug consumption more and more. So I think global demand for drugs will increase. If they are legalized, there will be pharmaceutical and consumer innovation. I'm in favor of innovations in chemistry. I'm in favor of innovations in understanding human biology. But I just don't think this will be a good industry for the human condition. There'll be some benefits on the margin medically. There'll be some people, of course, who successfully self-medicate or are successfully medicated. But for the vast majority of people, this will be a great distraction. And as long as that's the case, as long as we need this great distraction, the great medicalization, the great high, we could say everyone, the whole Western world basically is going to get high on something or other. There will be demand around the world. And I think there are countries that will be destabilized where radical groups use drug exports as their funding mechanism.
That's what well put. Is there anything we haven't yet covered relative to this piece, or relative to the country kind of at large, that you think is worth mentioning?
I think it's important to consider that while we do see all of these viral videos of drug violence in Mexico, is that the level of violence from Mexico's cartels against the legitimate government and even the general population is still far below that of Colombia in the 1980s. Basically, during the heyday of drug lords like Pablo Escobar, he would go as far as to commit outright acts of terrorism, like bombing airplanes. And this was while he was running for office, right? That was one of the super controversial things. He would go as far as to try to run for office directly. Mexico's homicide rate today is less than a third of Colombia's peak homicide rate in 1991, right? So Mexico is also becoming a much older country. So I would not be surprised at all if in 20 or 30 years, we start to think of a lot of these Latin American countries like Mexico, or possibly even Brazil, as boring, safe places, because all the young people who would commit crime have either moved out of these countries into the United States already, right? Or have gone old and they just physically can't be as violent as perhaps the incentives or the social environment could, tolerate. I think that, the idea of a Latin America that's still kind of impoverished, kind of dysfunctional, but is basically peaceful and maybe just is a boring resort destination, I think this will take people by surprise. The future of Latin America, maybe we already see it. We see it in Greece and in Portugal, and we see it maybe in Turkey, right? And, I think that will be surprising. This is not to say that, however, they're not small countries in Central America where the government has to win an actual war against the drug cartels right now to achieve peace. And I think in that regard, Bukele is a great example of someone who has won that peace and has massively reduced the murder rate. And I think this will be something that needs to be done in a number of these countries, because if you can bring a lower murder rate faster, this is just better for prosperity. It's better for life. And I think that's still a goal that's worth pursuing, even if it's not relevant to the United States. To who is it relevant? It's relevant to El Salvador. It's relevant to Honduras. It's relevant to Colombia. It's relevant to Mexico. It is a goal Latin America should set for itself and try to achieve.
I think that's a good place to wrap. My mother is Colombian, and a lot of our family has moved to Miami, to largely because it was unsafe for quite some time, or there were concerns about safety, and so I know that that side of the family would welcome that future that may be boring but safe. And you could then talk about how to have sort of the good parts of dynamism, from there perhaps. But it feels like maybe there's a Maslow hierarchy, thing that needs to happen first. And
Security first, and then
exactly.
prosperity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And El Salvador, we'll see what happens there.
Okay.
It's an interesting case study. Well, cool. Samuel, great conversation. And until next time.
Till next time. Thank you, Erik.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.